The jungle of Varith-Kel had no name in any language that mattered to Empress-designate Sorvin IV of the Valith Imperium, not because her people lacked words, but because her people had never needed one. The Valith had catalogued 11,000 ecosystems across 47 star systems. They had named gas clouds the size of solar neighborhoods and catalogued microbes living inside the cores of dying suns. They were a civilization 9,000 years old, meticulous beyond human comprehension, and they had decided, with all the confidence of ancient intelligence, that this particular jungle on this particular human-adjacent world was not worth a proper designation. They called it simply Varith-Kel, the Tangled Dark, and sent survey teams in only when the Imperial schedule allowed for it. Sorvin had not come on Imperial schedule. She had come because she was 23 years of age by Valith reckoning, roughly equivalent to 19 in the biological maturity of the humans her empire had recently made contact with, and because her advisors had decided that a diplomatic observation tour of the frontier worlds would be educational for a future empress. She had agreed loudly and enthusiastically for reasons that had nothing to do with diplomacy, and everything to do with getting away from the crystalline corridors of the Imperial seat on Valith Prime, where every wall seemed to whisper obligations at her. The survey shuttle had landed in a clearing 2 kilometers north of the jungle's edge. Her guard detail, 8 soldiers in environmental armor, their carapace plate gleaming violet in the thin morning light of this world's yellow sun, had formed the standard protective perimeter the moment the ramp descended. Commander Yethra, her head of personal security, a battle-hardened woman who had survived 3 separate assassination attempts and 1 accidental weapons discharge by an intern, had immediately flagged 17 potential threat vectors before Sorvin had even finished tying her field boots. This world's apex predators include the Varith cave bear, the scaled glider, and 17 species of venomous arachnids, Yethra said, reading from her scanner with the flat recitation of someone who had already given this briefing twice and been ignored both times. The humidity is, Yethra, 83%, and the canopy density will interfere with, Yethra. The commander stopped. She looked at the Empress-designate with the careful expression of a woman choosing her next words very deliberately. My lady, I would like to walk into the jungle. I know you would. Will you be stopping me? Pause. Yethra had served the Imperial family for 20 years. She had watched Sorvin grow from a small child who asked too many questions into a tall young woman who asked even more. She had long ago categorized certain battles as unwinnable, and this was one of them. No, my lady. We will be accompanying you. The jungle swallowed them within 50 meters of the treeline. It was extraordinary. Sorvin admitted this to herself privately, because she was not going to give Yethra the satisfaction of knowing she'd been right about the threat vectors. Varith-Kel was dense and layered in a way that the Valith ecosphere was not. Her home world's jungles were old and tall and organized by millennia of evolution into something almost architectural. This place was wild in a way that felt almost aggressive, vines crossing vines, roots buckling upward through soil, fungi the color of bruises growing in spirals along fallen trunks. The air was thick and tasted of green things. Her scanner reported 2,847 distinct biological signatures within a 50-meter radius. None of them were what she saw. She saw it between 2 enormous root columns of a tree whose canopy she could not see the top of. It was sitting in the shaft of yellow-white light that had found some improbable path through the canopy above, and it was sitting very still, as though it had been placed there deliberately. As though it had been waiting. It was small. Perhaps half a meter in length, low to the ground, covered entirely in fur so deeply black that it seemed to absorb the surrounding light rather than reflect it. It had 4 limbs, a long tapering tail, and a face that was almost unsettlingly symmetrical. 2 ears, triangular and upright. A small, flat nose that twitched once. And eyes, enormous, slightly tilted, of a color she could not immediately name. Not quite green. Not quite gold. Something that shifted between the two like light on water. Those eyes were looking directly at her. Sorvin stopped walking. The creature did not run. It regarded her with an expression that she could not interpret, which was itself extraordinary. She could read the emotional states of 16 sapient species, but this small creature's face was a language she had never encountered. It seemed neither afraid nor aggressive. It seemed, if she were being entirely honest with herself, faintly curious. She was faintly curious too. What, she said quietly, is that? Yethra's scanner was already up. No match in Imperial biological records. Quadrupedal, mammalian structure, endothermic, similar thermal profile to the smaller prey species in this region, but the neural complexity reading is significantly higher. Possible elevated intelligence. How elevated? Anomalously, the creature blinked. One slow, deliberate blink. Then it yawned, an action that displayed small, sharp teeth, and returned its gaze to Sorvin with what she could only describe as patient assessment. Something happened in her chest. A warmth she didn't have immediate vocabulary for. Like recognition without prior meeting. "Prepare capture equipment," she said, mostly to fill the silence, because the truth was she didn't want to capture it. She wanted to sit down beside it and not move for a very long time. But she was a future empress, and future empresses did not sit in the dirt of alien jungles because small black animals had made eye contact with them. "Perhaps it belongs to a dangerous species. We should contain it for study." Yethra relayed the order. 2 soldiers moved in from the left flank, and the creature's ears rotated toward them with eerie precision. Then, without haste, without panic, it simply stood, turned, and walked into the shadow between 2 roots. And disappeared. The soldiers searched for 40 minutes. They found nothing. No tracks, no thermal trace, no biological residue. The jungle had simply closed around it like water closing over a stone. Sorvin stood in the shaft of light where it had been sitting. The light was empty now and somehow colder for the absence. She did not understand what she was feeling. The Valith were not an unemotional people, but they were a precise one. They catalogued their emotional states as carefully as they catalogued ecosystems. What she felt now did not fit cleanly into any category. It was not grief. It was not longing exactly, though it resembled longing. It was more like the feeling of having been shown the first page of something and then having it closed. She wanted to read the rest. "We'll return tomorrow," she said. Yethra said nothing, which was her way of saying a great deal. When Sorvin returned to the shuttle that evening and filed her survey report to the Imperial records, she wrote 3,000 words about the ecology of Varithkel and included, in the appendix, a single paragraph about an unclassified quadrupedal mammal she had observed at approximately 0940 local time. She did not include the part about what it had felt like to watch it disappear. Some things belonged to her alone. The official diplomatic observation tour lasted 37 days. Sorvin extended it to 60. Her advisors were tactful about their confusion. Ambassador Drahal, a thin man whose entire career had been built on reading between political lines, sent her 3 careful communiques asking whether there were trade negotiations developing on this frontier world that she had not yet disclosed. Her personal secretary, a young woman named Tavith who was excellent at her job and appropriately terrified of her employer, rescheduled 42 separate imperial engagements without being told the reason why. Her mother, Empress Sorvin III, sent a single message that read only, "What are you doing out there?" Sorvin did not answer any of them. Every morning at 0900 she took her guard detail into the jungle. She varied the entry point, following Yethra's tactical advice about predictable patterns even as Yethra clearly did not understand the purpose of these walks. She moved slowly. She made no sudden movements. She wore the same field coat each time, a dark gray garment that she had worn on the first day, reasoning, without quite being able to explain her reasoning, that the creature might respond to familiarity. It did not appear. For 23 consecutive mornings, it did not appear. She began to study the ecology seriously during those hours, partly because standing in a jungle staring into shadows waiting for an animal to materialize was not behavior she could justify to herself in pure emotional terms, and partly because the jungle was genuinely extraordinary once she began paying attention to it properly. She found 17 species that were not in the Imperial Survey database. She documented the behavior of the scaled gliders, which were not gliders at all but primitive flight-capable reptilians whose wing membrane folded so completely against their bodies that they looked, at rest, like large lizards. She catalogued fungi, mapped root structures, identified 4 different types of bioluminescent moss that only lit up during rainfall. She also learned to be very quiet. The Valith were not naturally quiet people. Theirs was a civilization of sound, of song and ceremony and the constant low hum of machinery that powered the largest empire in this quadrant of the galaxy. But Varithkel rewarded silence. The more still she became, the more she heard, and the more she heard, the more the jungle revealed itself as a world of extraordinary complexity, each layer of sound nested inside the next like the rings of a tree. On the 24th morning she was sitting on a fallen trunk, reviewing her fungal documentation, when she felt something watching her. She did not look up immediately. She had learned enough about prey behavior and predator behavior in the intervening weeks to know that sudden movement was a conversation ender. Instead she finished the notation she was writing, set her scanner down on the bark beside her, and then, with the elaborate casualness of someone trying very hard to appear natural, looked up. The cat was sitting 3 meters in front of her. It looked exactly as she remembered. the fur that consumed light, the eyes that couldn't decide on a color, the ears angled forward with that quality of attention that she had been thinking about, without admitting she was thinking about it, for 24 days. It looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them moved. She became aware, slowly, that Yethra and the guard detail were arrayed behind her and that at least 3 of them had weapons drawn, and she held up one hand, flat-palmed, without looking away from the cat. The soldiers froze. The cat's eyes moved to the soldiers. Back to her. Its tail moved in a slow lateral sweep. Once, twice. She had been cataloging enough fauna to know that tail movement was a significant behavioral signal in a broad range of quadrupedal species, but she didn't know what it meant in this one. She decided to try something. She looked away. Not with sudden movement, she didn't turn her head. She simply shifted her gaze downward to the fallen log she was sitting on, and let it rest there. She breathed evenly. She made herself as small and unthreatening as she could, which was a strange experience for someone who had been trained since childhood to occupy a room with authority. She counted silently. Got to 47. She heard a soft sound. Footsteps. 4-footed, light, remarkably quiet but not inaudible. Something moving through leaf litter with the particular care of an animal that was choosing, deliberately, to be heard. She didn't look up until she felt the warm weight of something settling onto the fallen log beside her. The cat was sitting 6 centimeters from her left thigh. It was looking forward into the jungle, not at her. Its tail curled around its feet with the geometry of something that had chosen its position carefully. This close, she could see the individual hairs of its coat, the slight variation in the black, deep charcoal at the roots, absolute black at the tips. She held absolutely still and felt something very large happening in a very quiet way. After 11 minutes, she counted, the cat turned its head and looked at her directly. Up close, the eyes were even more affecting. There was something in them that her training kept insisting on calling intelligence, even as her scientific discipline reminded her that she had no empirical basis for that assessment. She decided her scientific discipline could be quiet for a moment. "Hello," she said softly in Vailith, which was the only language she had. The cat's ears moved. Not away toward her. As if the sound was interesting rather than threatening. It looked at her for a long moment. Then it looked back at the jungle. They sat together on the fallen log for 22 minutes before the cat stood, stretched with the complete physical abandon of something that had no predators it was worried about, and walked calmly back into the undergrowth. Sorvin sat where she was for several more minutes after it had gone. Then she picked up her scanner and wrote a note in the margins of her field documentation. Not a scientific observation. Just 4 words in her own handwriting. "I will come back." She did not know then if she meant back to the jungle or back to the exact feeling she had just experienced. The extraordinary plainness of sitting beside something wild that had chosen, of its own accord, to be near her. She suspected she meant both. What followed could not have been called, by any strict definition, a diplomatic effort. But it had the structure of one. Sorvin had spent 8 years studying the protocols of interspecies communication. The Vailith Imperium's contact methodology for new sapient species was among the most sophisticated in the known galaxy, built over millennia of first contacts both successful and catastrophic. The fundamental principle was always the same. Before you can communicate, you must establish safety. Before you can establish safety, you must demonstrate consistency. Consistency means showing up, behaving predictably, and never, under any circumstances, moving faster than the other party can follow. She applied this to the cat with complete seriousness and only mild awareness of how strange this was. Every morning, the same time, the same entry point into the jungle, the same gray field coat. She brought no food. She had read enough about wild animal behavior to know that food offering created a transactional dynamic that could undermine genuine approach. She asked her guard detail to wait at the treeline, which Yethra refused to do entirely but agreed to compromise on. They would follow at a distance of 40 meters and hold position unless her biometric readings spiked past threshold. It was the most she was going to get and she accepted it. The cat appeared on the 4th day of this new protocol. Not at the fallen log, but in a different location. Higher ground, a rocky outcropping above a narrow stream where it sat cleaning its face with a forepaw in the unselfconscious manner of something that had located itself with great deliberateness and was now simply waiting. She sat down below the outcropping and read from her data tablet. The cat ignored her for 30 minutes, then descended to the stream to drink, then came and sat approximately 2 meters to her left. Progress. She began talking to it. Not in any expectation of comprehension. She was not so far gone as to believe the cat spoke Vailith, but because silence felt like withholding, and she was not someone who withheld things she meant. She told it about the Valeth Imperium, about the 47 star systems and the 9,000 years and the way the imperial seat looked at dawn when the 3 moons of Valeth Prime were still visible and the light turned everything the color of old gold. She told it about her mother, who was a brilliant empress and a complicated woman, and about the weight of inheriting something that large. She told it about the 11,000 ecosystems that had been catalogued by her civilization and how none of them had prepared her for this jungle. The cat listened. Or at least, it sat with its ears angled in her direction, which she chose to interpret as listening. On the 12th day it touched her. She had been mid-sentence, explaining the mechanics of faster-than-light travel in terms that she was aware were completely inaccessible to a jungle cat, but the inaccessibility was not the point, when she felt a pressure against her right knee. She looked down and found the cat's head resting there, eyes half closed, a sound emanating from its chest that her scanner identified as a low-frequency vibration with no entry in the database. She recognized it, however. She had heard it in recordings from the human settlements on the adjacent continent. Purring. They called it purring. She placed her hand very gently on the cat's back. It did not move. The vibration continued. She stayed completely still and felt, in a way that bypassed all of her considerable intellectual machinery and went somewhere much deeper and older than thought, that she was being trusted. Not by a lesser creature. That framing felt immediately and instinctively wrong. By an equal who had made a choice. An individual who had assessed the situation over many days of careful observation and decided, on its own terms, that she was acceptable. That the distinction mattered to her was something she filed away to examine later. What she knew from that moment forward, the cat's trust was not a given. It was not a product of dependency or conditioning. It was a decision that had been made, and she understood, with the clarity of someone who had spent years studying the architecture of relationships between civilizations, that decisions freely made were the only ones worth having. She named it Sable. A Valeth word for deep shadow, the specific quality of darkness in the time before the moons of Valeth Prime rose. It seemed appropriate. It seemed like the cat had been waiting for a name, though she could not have said why she felt that. When she finally sent word to her mother that she would be extending the tour indefinitely and that there were matters requiring her personal attention, Empress Sorvin III replied within the hour. The message read, "Define indefinitely." Sorvin replied, "I'll know when I know, Mother." There was a pause of 6 hours, which was the longest Sorvin III had ever taken to respond to a direct communique in 40 years of correspondence. Then be careful. And document everything. It was, Sorvin reflected, a very Valeth thing to say. They always led with caution and followed with curiosity. She supposed she had inherited both. She looked at Sable, who was asleep across her boots. She documented everything. She brought Sable home in the 47th month. It was not a simple logistical exercise. The Valeth Imperium had strict biological quarantine protocols for any organism being transported between star systems. Not out of cruelty but out of hard experience, the kind written in the extinction records of 3 separate ecospheres that had learned about invasive species the catastrophic way. Sorvin worked with the Imperial Xenobiological Institute for 4 months before departure, submitting to every test, every scan, every review board with a patience that her advisors privately noted was unlike her in every way they could measure. She did it because Sable deserved to arrive safely, and because the alternative, leaving Sable behind, had presented itself to her mind briefly and been dismissed so completely that she had not needed to think about it twice. The xenobiologists were fascinated. They had never encountered this species before, and Sable was, in the controlled environment of their examination rooms, a profoundly uncooperative research subject. Not aggressive, but supremely indifferent to their professional interest in a way that the lead researcher, Dr. Vethan, described in her notes as humbling. What they could determine, the species was Earth-adjacent in origin, almost certainly descended from a population of Felis catus, the domestic cat of the humans, that had reached this world through some combination of human colonization and ecological drift several hundred years prior. The intervening generations had diverged from the Earth baseline in minor but measurable ways. It is essentially a cat, Dr. Vethan told Sorvin with the slightly deflated expression of a scientist who had expected more exotic findings. I know, Sorvin said, and did not explain why this was not in any way a diminishment. The journey home was 18 days in transit. Sable adapted to the ship with an equanimity that Sorvin found deeply characteristic. The first day was spent performing a thorough inspection of the available space, a process conducted with methodical seriousness. The second day involved identifying the location of all vents, heating elements, and elevated surfaces. By the third day, Sable had established a routine, mornings on the observation deck, afternoons in Sorvin's quarters, evenings in a place Sorvin could never predict in advance but could always eventually find. At night, Sable slept against her side. Not at her feet, against her side, with a particular quality of placement that implied intention. The warmth of it was something Sorvin noted in her field documentation as significant, and could not bring herself to elaborate beyond that. Valeth Prime received them with the full ceremonial weight of an imperial homecoming. 3 moons in conjunction, which happened 4 times per year and which the palace astronomers had flagged as auspicious without knowing what they were flagging it for. The crystalline corridors Sorvin had fled were lit in the amber of formal reception. Her mother stood at the top of the main stair in full imperial regalia and watched her daughter climb toward her with a small black cat sitting in the crook of her arm. Empress Sorvin III was 61 years old and had ruled the largest empire in this galactic quadrant for 30 years. She had conducted negotiations with species whose biology made communication physically dangerous. She had overseen the settlement of 17 new worlds, the peaceable contact with 9 sapient civilizations, and the resolution of a border conflict that had nearly become a war. She was not, by any measure, a person who was easily surprised. She looked at the cat. The cat looked at her with the luminous green-gold eyes and the expression that Sorvin had learned to read, not approval or disapproval, simply assessment, the same assessment it gave to everything that was new to it. "This," the Empress said, "is what you stayed for." "Yes." "Pause. Show me." Sorvin set Sable down on the polished crystalline floor. Sable walked forward 4 paces, sat down and looked up at the Empress. Sorvin watched her mother, watched the tightness around her eyes that meant she was suppressing something, and then saw the precise moment when the older woman reached down, slowly, and Sable pushed its head upward against her palm. The Empress of the Valeth Imperium stood there for a long moment with a cat pressing its face against her hand. "Extraordinary," she said quietly, and Sorvin could not tell if her mother meant the cat or the fact that she meant it. The palace adapted. Sable adapted to the palace. The 2 processes occurred in parallel and with roughly equal amounts of chaos. There were 3 separate incidents involving senior advisors and their carefully arranged paperwork, 1 encounter with the head of the Imperial Guard that ended with his formal complaint being filed and then quietly withdrawn, and a period of approximately 2 weeks during which the chief astronomer refused to enter the observation dome because that animal sits on the star charts. Sorvin mediated. She also, privately, thought the star charts could survive the indignity. What surprised her, though perhaps it should not have, was the way the palace staff responded over time. Not the senior officials who were too invested in their own dignity to bend easily, but the younger staff, the attendants and clerks and kitchen workers who moved through the palace's lower corridors. They knew Sable's schedule within a week. They left water in the right places without being asked. The night shift attendant, a young man named Soru who was 19 and had never left Valeth Prime, spent his break sitting in the corridor outside Sorvin's quarters because that was where Sable sometimes came to be scratched behind the ears. "Do they have these where you found it?" he asked her once, with the reverence of someone asking about a sacred thing. "A version of it," she said. "Billions of them." He looked at Sable for a long moment. "The humans have billions of these and they still found time to build starships?" Sorvin laughed, genuinely, fully, the kind of laugh she hadn't produced in the crystalline corridors in years. "The 2 things may not be unrelated," she said. It was the first time she thought about what it meant that Sable's kind had grown up alongside a species that had eventually reached the stars. What it meant to be trusted by something that had spent 10,000 years learning to trust. The history of it. The weight of it. She didn't have language for it yet. But she was beginning to understand that she would need to find some. 7 years passed. Then 10. Then 12. The Valeth Imperium expanded its contact with the human territories during this period, a development that was diplomatically complex, politically contested, and historically significant in ways that multiple academic institutions are still arguing about. Sorvin, Empress Sorvin IV by the 6th year, her mother having stepped back from direct rule with the graceful precision of someone who had planned every detail of the transition, navigated all of it. Trade agreements, border negotiations, the careful construction of shared frameworks for species that measured time differently, valued different things, expressed conflict in different registers. The humans were, she found, extraordinarily various. They disagreed with each other about almost everything, including basic questions of governance and value and what constituted a good life, and they did all of this arguing with an energy and passion that the Valeth, who had settled most of their great debates in the 3rd and 4th centuries of their civilization, found both exhausting and compelling in equal measure. She found that she understood them better than her advisors did. She thought, sometimes, that Sable was the reason. There was something in the relationship between humans and their cats. She had read the literature now, all of it, the biological histories and the cultural anthropologies and the peculiar subcategory of human art devoted entirely to depicting cats in various states of repose, that was unlike the relationship any other species in the known galaxy had with a companion animal. It was not ownership. It was not domestication in the clean technical sense. It was something that had developed over thousands of years of two species choosing each other, repeatedly and individually, in an arrangement that benefited both but required neither. The cats had not been bred to need humans. They remained, in every measurable way, capable of independence. And yet Sable, who could have survived perfectly well in the jungles of Varith-Kel and who had demonstrated on multiple occasions a complete indifference to the opinions of senior Imperial officials, chose every evening to find Sorvin and sit with her. The choosing was the thing. It was always the choosing. She discussed this once with a human diplomat, a woman named Dr. Amara Chin from the human settlement of Kepler Station, who had been assigned to the Valith embassy with the specific brief of facilitating cultural understanding. Dr. Chin was precise, thoughtful, and possessed of the specific kind of dry humor that Sorvin had learned to look for in humans who were both intelligent and honest. "You figured out the cat thing," Dr. Chin said, when Sorvin tried to articulate what she had been turning over for 12 years. "I'm not sure I figured anything out. I'm trying to understand the structure of it. The structure of it is that cats don't have to like you." Dr. Chin tilted her head. "Every other animal humans ever domesticated, we bred the wildness out of them. Dogs needed us. Horses needed us. We made them need us or we selected for the ones that did. Cats never needed us. They showed up, decided we were interesting and stayed. And they keep deciding every day whether to stay." She paused. "Humans find that either very frustrating or very meaningful, depending on the person. Which do you find it?" "Meaningful. Obviously." A slight smile. "You don't spend 12 years with something you find frustrating." Sorvin spent a long time after that conversation thinking about the word meaningful. It was a human word, borrowed into Valith diplomatic usage but not native to it. The Valith equivalent was a word that translated more precisely as significant in the record, implying that meaning was something you verified by documentation, by entry into the archive, by the confirmation of external witnesses. The humans meant something different. They meant this matters to me, in me, regardless of whether anyone else records it. She thought she was beginning to understand the distinction. Sable was 15 in the 14th year. The human literature said this was old for the species, though not unusual. The xenobiologists confirmed that Sable's variant, the slightly diverged Varith-Kel population, seemed to age on a comparable timeline. There were changes. Sable slept more, moved with slightly more deliberation, had developed a preference for the warmest corners of any room. The eyes were unchanged. The quality of attention was unchanged. What had changed, Sorvin found, was that she had stopped thinking of the relationship as something she could categorize. She had tried, over the years, to find the right frame for it, the right entry for the archive. Companion animal felt reductive. Friend was a category the Valith applied carefully, after significant mutual history. Family was a word with specific legal weight in imperial usage. None of them were wrong, but none of them were complete. She stopped trying to find the complete word. She accepted, with a kind of peace that surprised her, that some things were larger than their vocabulary. The 14th year ended. The 15th began. She did not know then that it would be the last full year. It began with a storm. Valith Prime's weather was largely regulated. The Valith had developed planetary climate management technology in the 4th millennium, and the extremes of the natural world had been smoothed into something more predictable, more manageable, more safe. But the systems that regulated the northern continent experienced a cascade failure in the late autumn of Sorvin's 16th year with Sable, and for 11 days the planet experienced weather as it had existed before the great engineering projects. Real weather with the violence and unpredictability that implied. Sorvin had been in the northern capital for a treaty negotiation when it hit. She was delayed 9 days by grounded transit and was not concerned. The palace on Valith Prime was one of the most carefully climate-controlled structures on the planet, and Sable was in the capable hands of the night shift attendant Soru, now 26 and senior enough to have been given official duties alongside his unofficial ones. What she did not know, because no one thought to send her an alert, was that the cascade failure had affected the palace's climate management too. Not catastrophically, the emergency backups held, no one was in danger, but the temperature in the eastern corridors, where Sable had begun spending most days because the morning light fell there first and longest, had dropped significantly during the worst of it. Sable was old. The cold had found something to work on. She returned to find the palace restored, the treaty finalized, 17 messages of congratulation and 308 routine imperial communiques waiting in her queue, and Soru standing at the top of the main stair with an expression she had never seen on him before. The xenobiologists called it bacterial pneumonia, an opportunistic infection that had taken hold in the stressed respiratory system of an aging animal following cold exposure. They were thorough in their diagnosis and honest about the prognosis, treatable in younger individuals with robust immune function, but in an animal of Sable's age, complicated. They began treatment immediately. Sorvin set aside the treaty celebration and every commitment for the following 3 weeks. She moved her working hours to be wherever Sable was, rearranging the machinery of imperial governance around the small heated enclosure the medical team had set up in her quarters. Her advisors adapted with the practiced competence of people who had learned, over 15 years, that the Empress's priorities were not always the priorities they had been trained to expect. The Valith doctors were excellent. They were also encountering a species whose specific biology they understood only from reference material, and medicine practiced from reference material was not the same as medicine practiced from deep expertise. They made adjustments carefully and communicated honestly about the limits of their confidence. She contacted the human medical community. Not as a diplomatic gesture, as a direct request, personal, from one intelligent being to others who might have knowledge she lacked. The response was immediate and extensive in a way that she found, even in her distress, remarkable. Veterinary researchers from 6 different human settlements submitted available literature within 48 hours. 2 specialists offered to transmit in real time. A xenobiologist from Kepler Station, not Dr. Chin but a colleague of hers, a man named Dr. Park who had dedicated his career to feline medicine across multiple planetary populations, was on the next available transit to Valith Prime and arrived within 11 days. Dr. Park was 60 years old, spoke quietly, and regarded Sable with the specific eyes of someone who had spent decades learning to see what animals could not say. He examined Sable with the unhurried precision of a practitioner who respected the patient, and then he sat down with Sorvin and was honest with her. The infection is partially responsive to treatment, he said. We can manage the symptoms and make her comfortable. The underlying function is the issue. The lungs are stressed in ways that are cumulative. She's old, Empress. I can tell you what I can do, but I won't tell you I can make her young again. I understand. She's not in pain. That I can tell you with confidence. He paused. Whatever you've given her, however she's lived, she is a genuinely healthy old animal who has had a genuinely good life. You can see it. The coat, the muscle tone, the way she tracks movement. She has been well. Sorvin absorbed this. It was the kind of truth that contained a comfort she could only partially receive. The months that followed were what they were. There is no language for certain kinds of waiting that makes them easier to describe. The Valith Imperium continued to function. Treaties were signed, disputes were mediated, 9,000 years of civilization rolled forward with all of its ordinary grandeur and complexity. Sorvin did her work. She was present for all of it. She was also present for every morning that Sable was still there, eyes half open, watching the light come through the windows with the patient attention of something that had always known how to find the best parts of any place it had ever been. Dr. Park stayed for 4 months. He said near the end something that she carried with her afterward. I've treated a lot of animals and a lot of people who loved them. The hardest thing is not the dying. The hardest thing is that the love doesn't change size. The relationship ends, but the capacity you built for it doesn't go anywhere. You have to figure out what to do with it. She thanked him. She did not tell him then that she had been thinking about this already, that she understood, in the way you understand things that you have not yet needed but have been preparing for without knowing it, that what she was carrying was too large to put down. Sable died on a morning in late spring, in a shaft of pale gold light through the east-facing windows, with her head in Sorvin's hand and Soru sitting quietly on the floor nearby. It was not dramatic. It was not peaceful in the way that word is sometimes used to mean absent of feeling. It was simply an end, a full stop at the end of something 17 years long, and the room afterward was the same room and entirely different. Sorvin sat with her for a long time. Then she called for the Imperial Archivist. The glass coffin was her design. She had thought about it for months before it became necessary, which she did not tell anyone because it seemed like the kind of preparation that required either explanation or privacy, and she preferred the latter. The specifications she gave the master craftsman of the Imperial Glass Works were precise. A particular clarity, a particular weight of frame, a particular dimension that would fit the specific contours of a small animal that had never stopped surprising her. The result was extraordinary. The Valith had been working glass for 6,000 years, and when they applied 6,000 years of craft to something a single person cared about this much, the outcome was something beyond mere function. The coffin sat in the east-facing room, Sable's room by universal agreement of the palace staff, though it had never been designated as such, where the morning light fell, and in the light it seemed less like a container than like a window. A way of looking at something that had not stopped existing, only changed states. The imperial archivist compiled the record. It was not a simple document. It ran to 47 volumes in the standard format, covering the first sighting in the jungle of Vareth Kel, the 23 mornings of failure, the morning that had not failed, the quarantine protocols, the homecoming, the 17 years on Valeth Prime, and every observation Sorvin had made over all of it, because she had documented everything as her mother had asked her to, as the Valeth always did. But it also included the things that were harder to document. The quality of trust freely given. The sound in the chest that no scanner had a prior record for. The way the palace staff had organized themselves around a small creature who had never asked them to. The conversation with Dr. Chin about meaning. The conversation with Dr. Park about the size of love. The record was entered into the Imperial Archive, where it joined 9,000 years of Valeth history. The Empress-designate who had become Empress had made the addition personally, with the formal notation that this was an account of significance not only to the individual but to the understanding of life in the broadest sense, an understanding that the Valeth Imperium considered itself in the business of accumulating. The human settlements heard about it through diplomatic channels, which was how most things moved between civilizations. The response was, Dr. Chin told her afterward, somewhat complex. There was a human tendency to find the story either deeply moving or slightly improbable, depending on the human. Which do most of them find it? Sorvin asked. Moving. Obviously. Dr. Chen's slight smile. We've all had a cat or wanted one. We know what it is. And the ones who find it improbable? They've usually never been chosen, Dr. Chin said simply, and let the observation stand on its own. Sorvin ruled for another 31 years. She was a good empress. Possibly, the historians argued afterward, a great one, though the Valeth were cautious about superlatives and preferred to let several generations pass before making that determination. She expanded the empire's contact with the human territories in ways that were careful and mutually respectful. She negotiated 7 major treaties and oversaw the settlement of 3 new worlds. She was present, in some capacity, for the first genuine trilateral diplomatic engagement between Valeth humans and a third sapient species. A moment that the records called the beginning of a new era, which was the kind of phrase historians reached for and which was, in this case, accurate. In the 43rd year of her reign she fell ill. It was not sudden. The Valeth tracked biological decline with precision, and she had known for several years that the Ark was what it was. She finished the work she wanted to finish. She made the arrangements she wanted to make. She wrote letters to people who mattered to her, including one to Dr. Park's grandson, who had continued his grandfather's work and extended it in directions the older man would have been proud of. She asked at the end to be moved to the east-facing room. Soru, 63 now, white-haired, one of the most senior members of the palace staff, who had never quite been able to explain to younger colleagues why his career had taken the shape it had, carried out her request. He arranged her as comfortably as possible in the morning light and sat, as he had once sat as a young man in a corridor, quietly nearby. She looked at the glass coffin for a long time. She said something, near the very end, that Soru recorded in his own private notes and that eventually made its way into the official archive. It was not a grand statement. It was not intended for posterity. It was spoken quietly in the direction of the coffin, as though finishing a conversation that had been going on for 47 years. She said, I found you. We got all that time. That was more than enough. They were placed side by side. This was not unprecedented in Valeth tradition. Interment alongside the objects and beings of greatest significance was an ancient practice, reserved for relationships that the civilization acknowledged as exceptional. The form it took had evolved over 9,000 years and carried now connotations not of death but of permanence. A declaration that what had existed here had mattered enough to preserve. The glass was extraordinary. 2 coffins of matched work, the morning light moving through them in ways the master craftsman had calculated specifically to honor the hour when the thing between them had first begun. That hour in the jungle when a shaft of light had fallen on something small and dark and perfectly still, and a young woman had stopped walking. The 47 volumes of the Imperial Archive sat in their cases nearby. What the archive could hold, it held. The facts, the dates, the documented observations, the scientific records, the diplomatic significance, the historical context. All of it precise, all of it accurate, all of it real. What the archive could not hold was the other thing. The thing that had no catalog entry and fit no existing classification and had been, perhaps, the point of all of it from the beginning. That thing lived in Soru, who talked about it to his grandchildren. It lived in Dr. Chen's diplomatic work, which always bore a quality of care she attributed to having watched, from close range, what genuine relationship between species could look like. It lived in the palace staff who had been young once and learned, from a small black creature who never explained itself, that choosing to be somewhere was the most powerful act available to any free being. It lived in the record, not in the words of the record but in the fact of it, the evidence that someone had thought it worth writing down, worth preserving, worth entering into the 9,000-year conversation the Vailith were having with the universe about what mattered and why. The Vailith were a civilization that measured themselves by the depth of their understanding. They had charted 11,000 ecosystems and 47 star systems. They had named gas clouds and catalogued microbes and built an empire out of careful knowing. They had not known, before a young empress came home from a jungle with a cat in the crook of her arm, that there was a category of understanding only available through the experience of being chosen by something that had no obligation to choose you. They knew now. The archive recorded it as the first direct documentation of reciprocal voluntary bonding between a Vailith imperial and a non-Vailith non-sapient life form, with full observational record from initial contact through conclusion. It classified this as significant for interspecies relations, for xenobiological study, and for the ongoing Vailith inquiry into the nature of consciousness and its expressions across biological forms. In the margins, in the handwriting of the imperial archivist who had compiled the 47 volumes, there was an unofficial notation, a breach of archival protocol that no one ever corrected, because no one who read it could bring themselves to. It said simply, "She loved a cat. The cat loved her." We do not yet have the mathematics for what this means, but it means something. That is enough to begin.